Over the years, there have been several UFO sightings that have been linked to crashes. Of course, the most well-known, or perhaps most notorious case, is the Roswell incident from July of 1947. Conspiracies and mystery surround the entirety of the case, considering all these years later, and we're still searching for answers. While there is much evidence surrounding the reality of the Roswell crash, have you ever given the thought that there might be an elaborate conspiracy designed to fake a crashed UFO? Well, one involves being created by US intelligence so that the Russians would believe we had powerful technology on our hands when we did not. One thing is for sure, we successfully made the Russians deeply concerned about our country possessing alien technology. In 1948, Hart Canyon in Aztec, New Mexico, there was a phony UFO crash landing. Frank Scully wrote a book on these events, Behind the Flying Saucers. One particular character, Silas Newton, with whom the FBI had a specific file. The story goes that Newton was secretly visited by two government representatives who pressed him about continuing to push the story to anybody who would hear him. Even though they knew, Newton would later admit that the story was a lie. However, the US government was far more concerned with pushing out false information in the form of a psyops campaign to confuse and terrify their opponents. This kind of psychological warfare would continue into the 1960s during the Charles Manson case, where they heavily implemented psyops strategies. But that's a rabbit hole for a whole other video. After this visitation, Newton was coerced into proclaiming the story was true, and the ruse was successful. A disturbing finding from a journalist who went by the name Dorothy Kilgallen had published the report of the 1946 crash. However, the military had the story pulled immediately from all news outlets. There are even reports from sailors serving on the battleship USS Alabama that the 1946 military craft had crashed directly in the Spitzbergen and was transferred on that ship to United States soil. But wait, it gets far more strange. General James Doolittle was working for an oil company named Shell, and for whatever reason, they supposedly sent him to investigate the crash. Now, why would an oil company send a general to investigate a supposed UFO crash is beyond me. Then, there's a lot of speculation that authorities had given journalist Dorothy sensitive information within the British government. But again, this pertained to a crash-landed UFO. To make matters more confusing, many sources at the time make no mention of Spitzbergen at all, suggesting that Britain was the crash site. Dorothy Kilgallen wasn't just some journalist, though. She was an iconic face during the 1950s and 60s, interviewing Jack Ruby about the Kennedy assassination, covering the Lindbergh kidnapping, the 1950 Sam Shepard murder, and even was featured as a panelist on the What's My Line game show during that era. However, her death was shrouded in mystery as she died from a drug and alcohol overdose in 1965. It turns out it was right after the Jack Ruby interview too. Some speculate that she was taken out because she knew too much information and was threatening to leak it. But this is a speculative theory. But if we look at the circumstances of her death, everything seems to support that theory. She had just publicly announced that she had information about the Kennedy assassination that would break the case wide open, only to be found on November 8th, 1965 in her apartment. She was found sitting upright. In her system was a deadly cocktail of barbiturates and alcohol. Speculation that she was either forced to drink it or committed suicide. Other writers during that time who had worked on the Ruby and Oswald case also happened to turn up dead under mysterious circumstances. Dorothy's sources on the 1946 crash were never verified. The story faded out along with her. Something worth noting is that the same year in 1952, when Newton got visited, an apparent UFO had crashed into the Norwegian island of Spitzbergen. There's even supporting documentation recalling the story of the fatal crash and recovery of the craft, supposedly from another planet. When you look at the hard evidence, the NSA's copy of this now declassified document varies slightly from other copies given to the US Air Force, US Army, and the US Department of State. In the NSA's documentation, the story is identified as a plant. If we rewind a little bit, two separate UFO crash accounts occurred in Spitzbergen. In May of 1946, the first was when bodies were recovered that same year in August. Retired General James Doolittle had visited to see the craft while on a trip to Sweden. This is again when he was working for Shell. There are anonymous sources that detail him arranging it to be relocated to the United States for further studying, but nothing is conclusive. Then, to coincide with everything else, a German newspaper had first reported the Spitzberg crash in June of 1952, stating that jets of the Norwegian Air Force had spotted a downed UFO while flying over Spitzbergen. It went on to detail how the craft was disc-shaped and even explained how it spun. Russian writing, the ship was crewless and controlled via remote. However, as the story had been retold repeatedly, it had begun to change over time, and at one point or another, 7 alien crew members supposedly burned to death in the crash. Megan Quizette was making a cup of tea for her 12-year-old son, Andre, helping him sleep on January 3, 1979. She heard the family dog, Cheeky, barking excitedly outside as she walked towards the kitchen. She saw Cheeky heading out of the garden and up a new and unlit link road as she opened the door to find out what was wrong. Andre followed them, worried that the neighbors would be bothered by their dog's barks. Each of them observed a glowing pink light as they approached the link road, and when they went closer, they could see that the light was encasing a gray metallic craft. The egg-shaped object landed with 4 legs that resembled spider legs and supported the object's weight as it sank into the ground. 6 humanoids stepped out of the craft. 2 of them greeted Megan and Andre in a foreign language, who walked over and said hello. Despite her initial lack of fear, Megan suddenly felt uneasy. It seemed like an instant later that the whole crew was back inside the craft, with the door that they had come through shutting. Then the object went airborne. A buzzing sound, such as a hive of bees, could be heard, and in a matter of seconds, the craft had become nothing more than a distant pink light. The next day, Megan had reported the sighting, and investigators found a corroborated account from a husband and wife who were driving in the same direction at the same time when they saw this oval-shaped craft with legs. It makes you wonder, what is out there? Just recently, back in November of 2021, an Argentinian woman identified as Irma Rick came forward with a claim that she was abducted and transported for over 40 miles. She was eventually dropped off in the middle of nowhere with practically zero memory of what had happened. The case ended up receiving national attention due to the reluctance of authorities and the withholding of information on a local and national level. Now, in February of 2022, there's been yet another abduction, this time involving 3 individuals in their truck. When interviewed about this, they had mentioned first seeing lights, and they had wondered if it had anything to do with the Victorica Agricultural School being lit up, but soon realized it could not be the case due to distance. Yet another couple and their adult son were returning home on Provincial Route 105 to Victorica when at around midnight, early February, they began to take notice of some strange, out-of-place lights. The event occurred while they were crossing the eastern border of La Pampa towards the center of Argentina. The lights confused them, thinking they were already close to Victorica, but realized they were still 26 kilometers away. It was only just moments after they had arrived. All being confused, they took a gander at the GPS, and they were not crazy after all. The GPS was still reading that they had 26 kilometers to go. After that, they traveled the first few blocks downtown, and the GPS finally zeroed out and corrected itself. With the surrounding circumstances of high strangeness, this cannot certainly be a case of a GPS glitch, could it? Or is this just yet another reoccurring case of a lost time anomaly? The same area is filled with recent abduction stories, animal and cattle mutilations, and even reports of the supposed chupacabra. What makes the addition of chupacabra sightings interesting is that they have been popping up in recent years all over Chile and Argentina. With the 2020 pandemic, sightings have skyrocketed. In addition, there was yet another cattle mutilation in a northeastern town in Argentina. It is getting so bad, the locals are becoming worried. Although cattle mutilations are often attributed to UFOs and extraterrestrials, many attribute them to chupacabras exclusively. These cattle are discovered with tongues, eyes, udders, reproductive organs, and blood removed with surgical tear cuts. Even the local authorities are clueless, with ranch hands and cattle owners fearful of going public because they do not want to be ridiculed. One of the latest victims of this chupacabra rampage is around 50 llama and alpaca calves near the end of January 2022. These calves were found with holes in the sides of their neck with no missing entrails or meat being eaten. Even those in Chile are concerned about the killings, enlisting the help of local veterinarians who simply cannot identify the bite marks in these animals' necks, and finding no tracks or footprints around the carcasses, and seeing the evidence that these animals are not fighting back against their attackers. None of it makes sense. A farmer near the southern edge of Paraguay just had his sheep slaughtered by something that he speculates was much larger than a dog. There's been no veterinarian to examine the carcass, which leaves things up in the air for speculation. When When you look at the geography and the amount of agriculture in South America, this seems like the perfect spot to get away with murder. These sorts of things are happening all over South America in increasingly high volume. Is there any possibility that what is going on with cattle mutilations has any link to the UFO sightings and other supernatural anomalies occurring? If so, this means that South America is a hot spot for all things supernatural. The real question is there any real correlation between Irma Rick and any of the other eyewitnesses? I'll let you be the judge. One of the strangest UFO accounts on record happened on August 21st, 1972, Roosboom, South Africa. Doris Muthwa and her 12-year-old daughter made a report of a sighting they both had. They were drawing water from the nearby river when Doris noticed what looked like a man in a white suit who was smoking a cigarette. That's when she looked a little closer and realized he had this strange blue-pink light emanating out of his chest, and then the smoke grew and grew until it was a great big fire, she described. Both Doris and her daughter were amazed at what they saw, and then the figure rose from the ground, levitating and ascending. When Doris was asked for more details about this strange man she had witnessed, she claimed he looked around 11 feet tall. After levitating for a few seconds, he shoots in the sky, completely vanishing. Directly after this, Doris and her daughter both reported a strange electrical sensation going throughout their bodies, similar to the sensation of being shocked by electricity. Investigators believed some electronic wave technology had to have been used. In correlation to this event, on August 16th, an individual named Elias Kosa had reported seeing what they described as a monster. They had small blue flames burning around their feet, and then, just like the man Doris and her daughter saw, vanished in a flash of smoke and flames. I'm sure you've heard the conspiracy about a military base on the moon. Regardless of what you believe, the story surrounding it is fascinating. Donna Hare, an award-winning NASA employee who also worked for Philco, which NASA contracted back in the 1960s, their purpose and job was to provide NASA with a worldwide tracking station network. She was also subcontracted for 15 years, working in the photographic laboratory in Houston, Texas. Her story is fascinating. One time, she had entered into the photographic data room where they had collected recent information on the Apollo missions to the moon along with NASA's satellites in orbit. The information collected was to be studied. It was then that Donna had a chance to speak with a colleague who showed her a photograph that displayed a clearly defined circular-shaped object sitting in the skies. Now, her colleague just explained that he could not tell her what it was, but explained that his job involved airbrushing this imagery to ensure no aerial anomalies were making their way into the public domain. A man named Carl Wolf possessed top-secret clearance in the U.S. Air Force, and in 1965 was essential because it connected with NASA's lunar orbiter. Supposedly, Carl spoke with a fellow airman who addressed his deepest concerns of a large military base located on the moon from NASA photographs. The base was of unknown origin, although there were zero doubt about it being misinterpreted rock formations. This was something else entirely. Wolf's pictures showed defined structures, large and covering a wider area than initially thought. Wolf broke the conversation further, realizing he had just tapped into some top security level intel. There's speculation that the base in question is not an alien base, but in fact a military structure we created. These plans have been in place for a long time, called Project Horizon, military plans to construct a base on the moon that has been in swing for some time. The initial plan was to begin building an installation on the surface by the mid-1960s and move from there. The goal was to arm it with nuclear weapons to eliminate any Soviet threat. Supposedly, it went into full effect in March of 1959. Lieutenant Arthur Trudeau was the general overseeing the plans to create said base. At the time, he was the chief of R&D. The now declassified files on Project Horizon reveal that the estimated cost would be around $6 billion to design and fully equip. Trudeau, speaking about the base in Project Horizon documentation, said this: "There is a requirement for a manned military outpost on the moon. The lunar outpost is required to develop and protect potential United States interest on the moon. In addition, to develop techniques in moon-based surveillance of the Earth and space, and communications relay and operations on the surface of the moon, for further exploration into space and for military operations on the moon if required, and to support scientific investigations on the moon." To the knowledge of current day, the project never came to fruition due to budget constraints and technology pitfalls. Is it possible the government and military could somehow move ahead and clandestinely build this base without anybody knowing? Or is what Wolf saw on the moon an advanced base, and NASA is covering the whole thing up? It makes you wonder. In 1972, a woman who wished to remain anonymous was subject to a bizarre abduction experience. One evening, after going to bed and lying there, she suddenly begins hearing this low humming noise. She attributed it to sound like a low-flying helicopter and was confused by this. The sound only grew in intensity and started getting louder. The entire house began to rattle and shake, almost like she was caught up in a whirlwind. Having had zero memory of how she got there, she was transported to the strange room in the blink of an eye. Surrounding her were these bizarre robotic beings. They were examining her, performing tests, and studying her. They even spoke to her telepathically. Oddly enough, she reports not feeling any pain or fear during the entire incident, just confusion. And shortly after this, she was returned to her room. Her story doesn't entirely end there. She had been revisited by one of these alien robots because they had left a piece of equipment embedded in her leg. While bizarre, many skeptics scoff at such a story, but when you look at the grand scheme of abduction cases, it does seem to fit right in with the rest. I think an important note to take from this is the time frame. In 1972, pop culture was so primitive in the in-depth knowledge that our current day and age society possesses. Sure, many still point and laugh at the public abduction cases, even the most bizarre ones. However, you also have to look at her incentive to share such a wild tale. Surely anybody experiencing such a thing at that time would be terrified of ridicule. It's no wonder she chose to withhold her name. Do you think her story is just another experience with zero validation, or is she one of the many who have been forced to experience a different side of reality? Founder of the Flying Saucer Review, Gordon Creighton. Creighton believed the extraterrestrials were responsible for the whole UFO phenomenon, just as many others. There was, however, a point when that changed, and significantly. Historically, Creighton concluded that UFO phenomena originated from Middle Eastern jinns, not extraterrestrials. A full-page obituary of the man was published in 2003 in the Times newspaper of the UK, and the obituary stated the following: Gordon Creighton spent most of his working life with the government, but his greatest accomplishment was possibly dealing with unidentified flying objects. The worlds of diplomacy and Whitehall seemed strangely at odds with his conviction with extraterrestrials visiting Earth. A former intelligence officer on Russian and Chinese affairs at the Ministry of Defense studied maps in Oriental and other languages while working with the Permanent Committee on Geographical Names. The intelligence post which Creighton served was below the Whitehall Department, where the Air Ministry and the RAF were investigating UFOs. It is important to note that after the late 1970s, Creighton never again believed that ETs were visiting us. Jinns were always involved. Further, he admitted to fearing the jinn in private. Brad Steiger's situation was similar. It gave him the impression that the Men in Black were agents of the US government. Brad's thoughts, however, changed dramatically by the 1960s, and he eventually took a paranormal course. Is it possible Men in Black are just mythological figures familiar to all cultures? These are known generically as the trickster by ethnologists. While often appearing to play pranks on humanity, intended to teach or instruct its human charges, the trickster introduces them or undertakes transformational movements within the world for their benefit. Most cultures generally believe that the trickster is a primitive being that emerged soon after the creation of the world. Seeing the MIB as nothing less than paranormal entities was nothing short of a revelation to Brad. George Hunt Williamson is another of the more well-known contactees from the 1950s. Unfortunately, Williamson did not choose to contact his alien friends the same way as so many so-called contactees. These people claimed close encounters with aliens in desert environments during the 1950s. Some years later, in 1954, both Williamson and UFOologist Al Bailey published their volume devoted to the saucers, The Saucers Speak. To attempt to contact extraterrestrials, Williamson first focused on using shortwave radio as an alternative medium. However, it wasn't long before Williamson started using other devices, including Ouija boards, to locate the spirit world. Williamson claims to have communicated with Adu of Hayton in Andromeda, Agfa Alpha from Mars, Ankar 22 of Jupiter, Artok of Pluto, and numerous other bizarre alien names. The only thing I would like to emphasize here is that anybody who has attempted to contact paranormal entities knows that it is challenging to determine whether the voice is coming from the target or a manipulative or dangerous entity. I'm afraid that the truth may never be known about Williamson. The Collins elite was a small group of analysts in the US government who believed UFOs were extraterrestrial in origin, but later thought the entities were demonic. Ray Boake, a priest and UFOologist, was interviewed on January 22, 2007. During the interview, Ray had discussed how he'd come into contact with members of U.S. government who advocated that aliens are demonic. Only days afterward, Ray went into the full story of how he had been approached by two employees of the Department of Defense and how they were looking for Ray's help. The story goes that this group was trying to contact non-human entities, as they're called. Many had fell ill after attempts to contact these entities, the same ones that many from the UFO committee would refer to as aliens. Others even died who were part of the organization. Others had quit because they were fearful of the portals they had opened in trying to contact these beings. There's strong evidence to support that UFOs or aliens go hand in hand with occultism, demonic phenomena, satanic ritual abuse, and the supernatural. Perhaps one of the most frightening things about certain UFO cases is when there is evidence of trauma and death left in the wake of the abduction. However, one documented event back in the 1970s in Brazil will shake modern-day skeptics. While there are many questions surrounding this incident, it is said to be one of the very few cases involving a human being directly dying to an encounter with a UFO. Quixadá, Brazil, home of Luis Barroso Fernandes, a simple man who farmed on his rural property outside of town. He was your average everyday man. However, Luis would taste the unexplained on April 3rd, 1976. Fernandez was in the middle of doing a routine check on his cattle. At this time, it was early in the morning, around 2 a.m. Nothing out of the ordinary for Fernandez just yet. As he was making his way along the property line, he allegedly saw a metal craft that reminded him of a disc descending over the ground close by. The sound he had described was like that of a swarm of bees. He was stunned, shocked, blown away. He had never seen anything like what he was witnessing. His horse was starting to react and freak out. He then describes this craft firing a bright beam of light at him, and then he describes two humanoid beings coming out and shining what he describes as flashlights at him. Then they quickly disappeared into the craft, disappearing off into the night sky, and he was quoted as saying this: "We received a light and we were stopped, unable to move. The animal and I, of course. It opened up a kind of door and appeared two short stature beings. They were normal people, albeit with weird clothes and a kind of flashlight in hand, pointed one beam of light at us, and I lost consciousness." The bad news for Fernandez is that this would only be the first of several visits. After he awoke from losing consciousness, he had a throbbing headache and even difficulty breathing. His limbs were sore and he had trouble moving them. Then he noticed one side of his body had been completely burned, akin to a severe sunburn, except this was all around 2 in the morning. After finally making it back to his house, which was a struggle, his family does everything to get him examined by the local doctor. After seeing the doctor, he wasn't sold into Fernandez's story about what had happened, but could not explain these bizarre injuries all over his body. He decided to have Fernandez rest, sending some medication with him. This was just the beginning. The weeks went on, and Fernandez began to very slowly lose his functionality. His behavior changed, and he seemed cognitively less functional. He began to revert to a childlike state in the coming weeks. What's also bizarre was that he appeared to be getting younger. His skin was glowing, looking healthier and more youthful as he would in his younger age. He was reverse aging. With his apparent medical condition baffling everybody, psychiatrists and doctors could not figure out what was wrong with him. It had now appeared he had reversed his age and was now more physically youthful. His mental condition was worsening. Whatever medical condition he had would eventually kill him in 1993. By the time he died, he had reverted to such a state of mind that he was only able to speak 3 words: mom, give, and fear. Fernandez's case stands out as one of the most bizarre UFO accounts due to him directly dying from contact with these beings. Even from all the medical professionals that spoke, looked at, and attempted to treat him, no one could come up with an explanation for any of it. This, however, would not be the end for his family. UFO sightings and reports would skyrocket all around the area. Fernandez's son goes on to experience several bizarre accounts with UFOs. Even many doctors and medical staff who worked with Fernandez had seen a few of their own. The report indicates that at least one other UFO has been spotted near Quixadá, and it appears to be attacking humans. Here is Francisca Rosette de Silvia's story and her brother's account. Francisca, 23, and Antonio, 12, saw a blazing light through the trees while walking alongside a wooded area. The witness reports that a beam of light then struck Francisca, causing her skin to burn and leaving her disoriented and dizzy. Despite no apparent cause, doctors found swollen eyes, bruises, and burns on her body. Fortunately, Antonio was unharmed, and he said of what he saw, quote, "What I saw, I didn't want to see ever again." It was not a plane, helicopter, or another known thing. It was strange and threatening, is what he said. Something happened here that caused this UFO activity to spike and target these innocent people. Why would entities do such a thing? Was this a possible lone attack? Is there a motive? Even now, Fernandez is the only person ever to have been killed directly from a UFO attack. So what do you guys think? And that, my friends, is going to wrap up today's video. I hope you enjoyed yourselves and, more importantly, expanded your mind with new knowledge. If you enjoyed this content, be sure to smack that like button, leave a comment down below, and if you're new to the channel, what up? If your viewing experience was mostly pleasant, be sure to hit that subscribe button and make sure your notifications are set to on. This way you won't miss a single upload from yours truly. Until next time, guys, stay safe, and I'll see you all in the next episode.